Aviators! Today I'll review a very popular mid-range joystick, VKB Gladiator NXT EVO Space Combat Edition, also known as Kosmosima in its premium variant. That's a long name to digest, but basically Gladiator is the base, NXT is its second iteration I guess, and Kosmosima is the grip. And it is a very universal grip with tons of heads/buttons, which is why I chose it. There are other grips for the same base, even an adapter which converts the stick to a throttle, which is possible thanks to its customizable setup of springs and dampeners. I'll talk about this more at the end of the video. VKB Gladiator is my third stick after Thrustmaster's forgettable Hotas X and reasonable T16000M. And I can say it's the first one that lasted without any quality issues for well over a year. I bought it exactly 18 months ago, and I appreciate this reliability. I mentioned the premium version of the grip. I went for it to get the head under the thumb on the side of the stick instead of a button, and also the rapid trigger, which is like 2 additional buttons. There is also a ministick instead of a head on A1 position. I don't use it as a ministick, but it works great as an 8-way POV, because 4-way head is not an alternative for this. You will also get all the spare parts if you wanted to convert your premium version into non-premium for whatever reason. Even if you think you don't need the head and the rapid trigger, think about the POV function, which is not available otherwise without the ministick. So if you need POV on your joystick, you definitely want the premium version. Let's start with the overall stick shape, size and build quality. The stick is made of plastic, a couple of pieces screwed together, but it feels solid and good enough for this price range. If I look for some rough edges, I'd find them, but nothing that bothers me while playing. The stick seemed to be a bit short at first. I removed the default low palm rest and I'd still reach everything easily, but I needed to bend my thumb a bit more than I'd like, especially on this side head. But after some time I didn't see any problem with this. There are some protrusions near the palm rest. First they bothered me a bit, more than they helped with the grip if they do at all. But this was not a problem after a while. Perhaps my hand got resistant or the edges got smoother, I don't know. The base has a metal plate with mounting holes and also features rubber pads. Thanks to this, the stick is heavier than my previous ones. I use the joystick on the desk and it doesn't dance on it nearly as much, but it's far from perfect, especially with the stronger springs, even the default pre-installed ones. This is not a problem if you attach the joystick to some mount. I'll talk about buttons and heads later, now let's talk about the stick action. The Gladiator is a pincer gimbal design, and you can customize it by changing springs and adjusting the dampeners. There are 3 sets of springs of various strengths, with plenty of spare ones in each set. I'd not mind having even softer springs than number 10s, but otherwise the selection is generally fine. The stick feels like it's more resistive to the push than pull, and it definitely recenters much slower from the front position than from the others. Left-right is pretty symmetric, but the forward-backward axis is noticeably asymmetric. After a while I got used to it and I don't have a problem to push it. Sometimes I use the thumb position between A1 and A4 heads for more precise push. Generally, push still feels more odd than pull, perhaps it even should, although it's not very nice for helicopters. I don't remember this problem with the T16000M joystick, but it's always the same. Player need to adapt to the new device over time. Originally I started with tighter clutches, which means the stick was more damped and recentered more slowly. But as nice as this feels out of the sim, it's fatiguing and not helping while maneuvering, especially with coming out of the bank. I released the tension gradually on a few occasions eventually. The thing is that tighter clutches, which means more damping, does not only slow down the joystick when it recenters, it also prevents fast movement away from the center, so it actually adds to the spring strength. For a year I also used the default springs, 20, but later I went for lighter ones, number 10. This is highly individual, but this suits me better, especially for helicopters. Actually, while preparing for this review, I tried also springless action with tighter dampeners, and then tried springs number 20 again, and now I find them not just too heavy, but also annoying for desk stand and stick, as I leave the unloaded side of the base quite often, unless I weigh down on the stick. Finally, the center in action. I hoped there would be less of it, but it's still quite pronounced, especially with heavier strings. You can clearly feel when the string stops pulling one end and you need to start pushing the other side. If you just move diagonally around the center, you can feel how you're pulled towards it. It wants to snap there. Reportedly, this is the design feature of the pincer gimbal construction used in VKB Gladiator. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not that bad. I can't remember how it was with the T16000M, but that one also had a quite strong pull towards the center, especially considering how much lighter the action was there. I just expected less of it. But for that you have to go to a higher tier of joysticks with a different construction. I probably have to find another player with something like Gunfighter and try how it feels, whether it's a joystick for me. But until then I will stick to my Gladiator. All these reservations aside, I mostly like the stick. It's very precise, didn't degrade in any way over the time I've been using it, and its action is customizable. It's a worthy upgrade from my previous stick. The grip has a built-in twist module. The twist is precise but quite slow on return, and there is no way to adjust the tension. But these are just minor gripes. I've been using it for some time and there was no problem with it, but later I bought pedals and I locked the twist action completely. But it's immensely better than the one on a T16000M, which also breaks for many users, as it did to me quite soon. If you lock the twist, don't forget to remove the assignments for the axis in DCS or any other game, as it can still trigger small action around the center and you want to avoid any axis conflict. Let's talk about precision. The main axes are very smooth. If you go to the total extremes diagonally, you can't go to the maximum value, but that's probably expected. But otherwise, they go all around very smoothly, absolutely no oscillations, especially if you have serious dampening applied. But you can also apply very tiny corrections. In this case, I would welcome more resistance from the joystick, but you've got what you've got when you use looser springs, of course. Then we've got a ministick. Ministick is obviously limited when in precision, but otherwise it's also smooth and precise, but physically limited because it's so small. Now let's look at the throttle. Ignore the slight deflection of the stick, the dread line. Focus on the line that is coming from the top now. You can see that it's nice and smooth. It's easy to make also smaller corrections, but obviously it's not as precise as some longer dedicated throttle. Finally, there's a three-way switch, which recenters back. And it can be used, for instance, as a zoom if you use Gladiator as a single device without any throttle. So it works fine. I use it just as a three-way switch mostly. Heads and buttons. Let's start with the ministick, which also works as a POV, because with four-way heads you can't simulate all 8 directions. It is rather tall for my taste, and that makes it a bit unstable. It is easy to press and accidentally move at the same time, especially with the original head. Otherwise it works fine, especially as POV, which is how I use it virtually all the time. Other two heads on the face of the stick are great, feel solid, and all their actions are nicely defined. I don't recall ever having any problem or uncertainty with these heads. Great heads, I wish VKB used only these heads, which is not the case. I switched A1 and A4 heads, as I use A4 as a trim anyway, so the pyramid shape fits it better. And the other head makes it easier to press A1 without moving it. You have more lateral stability. Originally I wanted to use the A3, the castle dish, for POV, but this doesn't work very well as both other heads are taller and any of them on the A3 bottom head position would stand in the way when operating the POV dish. So I left the dish on A3 and only swapped heads A1 and A4. Of course I'm talking about the top of the head, not about the modules itself. It doesn't have switchable modules. Overall, the stick face design is great. I can reach everything easily and I never confuse one head for another. This happens to me on the throttle occasionally. Granted, this stick has just 3 heads and 1 button there. There are sticks with up to 6 elements on the face, so maybe this is a factor as well. But I say it again, the face is designed very well. The C1 head, thumb head on the side, is a bit fuzzy. Sometimes you press it instead of moving it. It is a very light press compared to the other heads on the face of the stick, and this makes the problem even worse. Its shape and position combined with the light press makes it quite hard to move it to the sides reliably. To move it right, you can go from the side, but there is no option for the left move. I have no problem with the forward and aft action. I would say this is the weakest point of the whole stick, and from what I've heard, you would get the same on the Gunfighter Modern Combat Edition grips as well, which is a shame if true. This makes me think about different brands for the next joystick upgrade actually. This head feels similar to the 5-way heads used on the Stax throttle. Those have similar problems, but not as pronounced as here, with this head on this position. Of course the position is fine, the head is exactly where it should be, but the head quality is subpar. It feels weak, cheap, uncertain, and the head shape itself doesn't help it either. Then there are 3 other buttons on the stick, one to release weapons, one on the side for the index finger, and a pinky button. They all work fine. There is a dual stage trigger and I like that one as well. Both stages are clearly defined. The first one is quite light, but has a nice click. The second stage is a bit harder and much further, so it's pretty easy to use one or the other as necessary. It's also easy to hold the first stage for a few seconds if necessary. I don't find myself getting out of it or into the second stage accidentally. So it really works great, and as I can't compare it with any other dual stage trigger, I can't say anything bad about it. The premium version of the grip also has the rapid trigger, which is a short lever above the trigger which can be pushed away or pulled back. It doesn't collide with the main trigger in any way, yet it's easy to reach as well. I like it, it gives me 2 more actions, and it also has that distinct feel to it. I'm generally quite light on it, as it doesn't require a lot of force, and I'd advise against pressing it too hard. I use it for stuff like safety on-off, switch to cannon or shoot deploy and so on, depending on the plane. Let's finish with the base that provides 3 more buttons, one self-centering switch, which is also a self-centering axis, whatever you choose to bind in the game. And then there is a slider axis which can be used as a mini throttle if you don't have one. And finally there is an encoder. This gives you a lot of flexibility, and the mini throttle, even though it's short, is quite precise and makes it viable for the Gladiator being your first single controller, and a good one at that. Of course you will want a throttle eventually, but when starting with flying on budget, I'd say a stick with some kind of substitute for a throttle is better than a throttle with a ministick to control your pitch and yaw. Of course, with the other hand on the throttle you will hardly use these additional controls on the base as often, but they are still there, including the 2 axes. Here I'd like to mention NXT ecosystems and their modules. There are 3 various modules and various mounting options, and while one of the modules is kind of standalone, the other 2 modules can be connected directly to the Gladiator from one side or the other, or even more modules if you want. I was actually thinking about both modules here and there, but in the end I decided not to go for it because it would make the operations with my joystick on my desk much harder to put it away and so on, and at the same time I didn't like the options on these modules. I don't criticize their value proposition, but I for instance want some switches, real switches, not just case switches and buttons, and they are not there, except for the flap lever for instance. I like these 3 levers on this module, that would be great for propeller planes, but why are there 8 more buttons? That really let me down. Eventually I also bought a VKB Stacks standard, and with its base, the stem module, there are many features from these modules like case switches, plenty of buttons, flap lever and so on, so I didn't want more of the same. You know, where are some dual encoders or normal axes with knobs, I mean rotary knobs, you know, or switches. Those are the types of controls I don't have, and if another module in the future will deliver it, of course I would be willing to pay a little bit more than this, because obviously those are more expensive features like solid switches and so on. Anyway, these are the options you will have with your VKB stack if you want, and they are great. Options are always great. Now let's return to the proper review again. When I mentioned the thumb head problems or the recentering action, I was probably a bit harsh, but those are all minor things in this price range, of course. And is there something else I miss on the stick? Yes, there is, and it's probably again a function of price. I'd love to see a real pedal axis which I could use as a brake, typically for Eastern style planes like L-39 or MiG-29, but currently for this you have to go all the way to the gunfighter with modern combat grip, and that one starts at 475 euros, which is the cheaper version without a twist. Or you have to change the team. For instance, Winwing Orion 2 Viper Ace EX joystick combo can be bought for 269 euros at this moment, which is on sale of course, and Winwing has quite substantial discounts quite often. And with this we'll get into the comparison section. The Gladiator product line over the time got better but also more expensive. Now it nearly touches the bottom of the higher end, as demonstrated by the Winwing sale I mentioned, and you would get way more capable product with that one, a product that is more aimed at the gunfighter actually. At the same time, there are more players entering the space in this price range, and it's hard to avoid another Winwing product, the newcomer Ursa Minor, which clearly aims at the Gladiator line but for much less, 159 euros normally, and right now on sale actually 106 euros. And that's a price difference where I'd be willing to try the newcomer, which may come with some compromises I had about head quality and so on, but brings a lot of options. With this sale price, I'd not even consider Thrustmaster's T16000M at all, and being on budget likely, I would not go for Gladiator either. Yeah, Ursa Minor is kind of a rip-off of the Gladiator, but that's something VKB has to deal with. If it proves reliable, it can be the new king in this area for much less. I mentioned my previous stick a few times, so let's talk about the upgrade from Thrustmaster T16000M, which mind you is in completely different price bracket. Here in Slovakia I can buy a new one from a local retailer for 62 euros, while my Gladiator would cost 214 euros now without shipping. So we're talking about roughly quadruple price. That's why this is not a comparison, as it would be unfair, but more of an upgrade appreciation. Gladiator gives you many more buttons, obviously. Thrustmaster got one POV 8-way head. And here you have a ministick, which gives you the same function, or even axis if you want, plus 3 more 4-way heads, all with an additional press as well. Yes, Thrustmaster got 12 buttons on the base, 6 always on the wrong side though, but all this gets covered by Gladiator's heads easily. Then the Gladiator has a better trigger, fast trigger, ministick action if you need it, better throttle axis, encoder, and of course much better joystick precision, not to mention the twist that doesn't break so easily. I had to babysit the Thrustmaster stick and re-grease it regularly. So far I didn't do any such thing for my Gladiator. I open it only to customize the action, which is not possible with T16000M. Generally my performance went up, although in some cases it took some time to readjust to the new feeling. But the precision and reliability is much better with Gladiator. Obviously the price difference, multiplier actually, shows both in the quality and in the options. I mean all the heads and such. Today, Ursa Minor makes it much harder to recommend Gladiator as the next step, and even harder as the first step, but the value is still right. Yes, relative value today is worse, the market happens, but the absolute value of Gladiator is justified. Now let's get back to the technical stuff and talk about a few options that the VKBDevCfg software gives you. And just as with my sticks reviews, this is no guide for the software. I will only highlight what I use for my stick to give you some ideas. I like the tempo option, which means that one button can do more things, one for short press and one for the long press. I use this for two things. Long tempo press on the ministick switches it between the POV and ministick action. For these I use this tiny red LED indication. And the long press on this base button F2 toggles between normal and double precision for the joystick. Let's start with this command screen, which is a bit scary, but we only set the tempo time here. This means how long you have to hold the button, so it triggers the other action. For me 500 millis is fine, maximum value is 1000 millis, which is 1 second. Now let's go to the profile here, buttons up here, and be sure to be on the physical layer. Let's check this pole so we can see what we're pressing. And when we press the ministick, we can see that it's this cell here. So let's open the configuration for this physical button number 13. And what you want is to have U stick here and tempo B here. Sometimes it messes up and switches to something else. Then we have to mess with it a bit more. But in the end, this is how we need it to look. So we switch between ministick and POV number 1, and we want the POV as the default at the start of the joystick. And with a long press, with the tempo action, you switch between ministick and POV. Now for the short press, I just map it to this button number 127, which is a logical button. Now use this set button to send the configuration to the device and wait for it to restart. And after the short press of this ministick, you will see that it generates button number 127. And with the long press, it switches between one and the other function. And the function is indicated by this tiny red LED. I think this is the default behavior and I don't have to change anything for that. Now the other scenario is I wanted the joystick to be more precise. And you can do this with so-called double rate action. Let's go back to this global command screen. And here you have double rate kind of ratio. And what I wanted is just 1 to 2, which means when you do the full deflection of the stick, it will just go to the 50%. You know, it's kind of like a saturation. Time DR is a transition time that it takes to go from one value to another when you switch between these rates. And 300 milliseconds is the maximum, but it's still better than nothing, of course. And I can demonstrate. If you go to the test and axis, you can see that when I go from full deflection to double rate, by holding F2 button in my case, for that tempo period, 500 milliseconds in my case. And you can see that the transition is smooth, which is definitely better than not having any transition, which could probably mess with your rotor in a helicopter or something. It's still better to switch between these modes when you are around the center, of course, but this helps making the transition smooth, of course. When we check the physical layer for buttons, we see that the F2 button is a button with a physical number 7. So we open the configuration, and first thing we want to do is to actually split this button to 2 other buttons. Because we want 2 different functions, we need 2 buttons. Normally you need a button to toggle the double rate, and because there is no direct support in this dropdown, we need to split this button into 2. One for normal action and one for longer press. And that's what we do here. So we choose tempo here and tempo 1 here, and now we can choose the button, which is a logical button, for the tempo action. And you will see that the short press goes to logical button 28, which is the default for this button. I don't know why it's made this way, but we will keep it that way. And the long press will trigger logical button number 70. And when we check the test for the buttons here, you can see that the short press generates button number 28 and long press button number 70. And this is the difference from the ministick press, because a short press generates number 127, but long press doesn't generate anything. It's completely internal action. So be careful when you bind this button to bind it only with the short press, not with the long press, because the long press is used for something different, and we get to it right now. As I said, the button number 70 is on the logical layer, so let's go there and let's see what the configuration allows us to do here. And while there are some options, there is nothing related to the double rate. If we go to the physical layer and let's click on this button, actually this click crashed the software for me just a while ago, but I upgraded to the newest version. And now when we look at the configuration, we can see that what you want here is this fixed axis. Sometimes what we get is not exactly what we want, but just get it to the state where you can see fixed axis here and DR here. Switch it to alternate action, choose axis 1 and 2, which are the pitch and roll, and with that you will enable or be able to toggle this double rate mode with this physical button 70. Now, one minor problem for you is that you don't see this physical number 70 here, and for that we have to finish last piece of the puzzle, which is this Boolean magic here, and you create a new one. I have it already here. So what I have here is this not module, which actually is not a not, it's a normal repeater. And here I chose logical layer 70 and here physical layer button 70. And this way I kind of replicated the logical button 70 on the physical layer. Whatever the logical and physical means here, for me it means that on the physical layer I can actually toggle the double rate magic, and that's it. Be sure not to have any inversion anywhere. You just want the press being interpreted as a press on the physical layer. One last thing I wanted is the double rate indication on my stick, so I can see it that I'm in this double rate mode. And for that I have this green blinking LED. And to set it, you have to go to global, external, LEDs. I forgot to mention that VKB software is only for Guru users, but this LED programming is for even bigger Guru users, and that's why they hid it. So you have to run this VKBDevCfg software at least once, and then you will have this zconfig in next to it. Go there and on the common section set test misc enabled to 1. If you don't have it there, just add it there, and under user section add user set to developer. Under the video in the description I will link how to do that, and I will link to that VKB LED programming video, okay? And here you have to find some free row, and I used row number 8. You switch the event to fixed axis. Operation is 4, this was kind of a guess. And LED is 10, fast blink, you choose the color and you're done. If you ask why the action is 4, I kinda deduced it from the fact that before that double rate there was FA1, FA2 and FA3, but it's a wild guess, so I'm not sure whether that's true, but it works. I didn't find a documentation for this one actually, so it was kinda magic. Of course, the indication has nothing to do whether I switch the double rate with tempo action or not with a normal press. It simply states that the double rate is activated, that's all. Before we wrap it all up, I'd like to show and comment on my experiments playing without springs and later with springs number 20 after playing with number 10s for a long time, and how this affects the helicopter gameplay. I've never played without springs before, so it necessarily will be a bit awkward. But while the theory says that the cyclic or the joystick acts a little bit like a cyclic in helicopter, and some helicopters have very light cyclic, I would appreciate some, tendency of the cyclic to go to some stable position. And in Huey, you actually have this, power cyclic. That's why the switch is there, and you can trim the cyclic into the position you like. It was strange because you could find the right position, and just hover for a while, but if you needed a tiny correction, it was very difficult to find the right position again. So that was kind of tricky. Now, of course, I'm not a very experienced pilot, so you will see me messing with the pedals and so on. But the problem is that you can't feel the helicopter, and it's very easy to overcompensate with this setup. Another thing I don't like about this setup is if you want the stick to be stable, if you don't want it to, for instance, fall forward, and it is a bit forward heavy, of course, it needs to be, the clutches needs to be tightened quite a bit, and that makes it very resistive. So it's kind of annoying that you have to put much more effort into any correction. Of course, this style has also some benefits, because you can easily leave the joystick in any position and it doesn't press on your hand. But this benefit of course renders any trimming unnecessary. You can't actually trim because you would have to find the central position, which is very difficult without springs. But it also means that if you have the right position and you move away from it, it's very difficult to return to it. And without the feeling of the helicopter, it's even harder. So I appreciate people who can play with this style. I probably didn't put enough effort, it's just a few minutes here, but I like my trimming quite a lot, so I will probably keep trimming and using springs. But let's try the harder springs for a change. Immediately you can see the first problem. Even with the default number 20 springs, it's very easy to lift the base without enough downforce on the joystick. That's why I removed my hand support, but that makes it of course harder to hold the stick deflected for a long time and do tiny corrections around that point. This of course can be alleviated with the trim, which I did now. For trim I use the weapon release button, the red button on the face of the stick, which is not used, there is no button like that on in the Huey or Gazelle, so I'm fine with that. I don't need two separate fire buttons like in many fighter planes. Maybe I will need it for, I don't know, Black Shark, I don't know, but I will work around that later. I don't use press on the side head, but because I never trust it enough, I can accidentally push it sideways instead of press it, so I decided to opt for this red button on the face. Maybe the button on the side would be even more convenient because it's a typical position for a thumb, but at this moment this is my setup. It's easy to of course switch it if I need it. Now when it's trimmed, it hovers nicely and I can do tiny corrections and just relieve the pressure on the stick. It will return to the position. It doesn't mean that that you can't over control it. It's like I still can and I will. But this is where the double rate we talked about before comes very handy. When I do prolonged hovers, I actually switch it to double rate, and while it is kind of a cheating, you know, the stick is very short. It's not like a real stick, so it kind of compensates the shortcomings of the gaming gear like this, and it makes the hardware much better, much stable, much easier to do tiny corrections. And the trimming in helicopters also helps if you play with some curvature, because you can't use curvature and that springless style, because it would be much more sensitive away from the center, which is not what you want. So if you play without springs, you probably can't use any curvature at all. And for me, I try to play with less and less curvature. Oh, tiny problem there, no problem, VRS for you. And I still lower my curvature over time, but for a beginner it's definitely easier to start with some curvature. So that's about the comparison of these two styles. I will definitely return to those springs number 10 to make it easier, and so I can use my handrest again. But that's VKB in action for you, and with Huey. Of course, it's very good for jets as well, no problem with that. I used it regularly. Now I'm playing helicopters a bit more. So let's wrap it up. I totally forgot about unboxing experience. It's very straightforward, although some assembly is required compared to, for instance, Stack's standard that comes out of the box as a single piece and you don't have to do anything. But there are videos, official VKB videos that will help you with that. I had no problem to assemble the piece, so that's fine. When it comes to capabilities, obviously it's a very good stick. Plenty of buttons, plenty of heads, axis, very precise axis. It has a noticeable centering and weak thumb head on the side, but these are really minor gripes. It has fantastic ergonomics otherwise, and it's very precise, so totally recommended. Quality is also great, all the plastic feels solid, there is no degradation in the experience after 18 months at all. It still works as new, I think so at least, you know. I can't compare it with a new unit, but for me it still works like new. And then there is the whole ecosystem, VKB software. I like it very much. It's of course not a very user-friendly software, but if you learn it, it works fine. Sometimes it crashes, you just update it, and most times it works very well. And in the end you will get the results you need. And when it comes to NXT modules, if it's your thing, you can attach them to the joystick and add more buttons to it or other features. So it's very flexible, customizable, and the price is right, quality is right. It comes highly recommended. I know it was a long video, but it will be only one. There will be no parts 2 and 3, so I hope you appreciate that. And with that, fly safe and see you later.